all moved away as the magician began beating his membrane drum over Ootah's body. Working himself into frenzy, he called upon his familiar spirits, for, according to their belief, illness and the suffering resulting from wounds are actually caused by the spirits of the various members of the body falling out of harmony. Then the Anguk must persuade his friends in the other world to restore peace among the spirits of the human hands, feet, head, or whatever limbs may be affected. The soul, or great spirit, they say, resides in one's shadow, and sometimes this falls out of agreement with the minor spirits of the body. Then one is in bad shape indeed. For half an hour the chant and dance continued. Meanwhile Ootah opened his eyes and often smiled at Annadoah. He was better, he told them, and motioned the Angakok to go. He bade Annadoah sit beside him. He felt unquestionably better. "You have asked me whether I went far over the mountains? Yea, we traveled many sleeps, yet we scarcely rested. The world was white about us. The spirits carried us over dark places in the hills, where Unforgiving makes his home, but he did not strike. We were borne over abysses. The spirits of one's ancestors are often kind. We went through the world of the fog, she who was the wife of that hill spirit who carried the dead from their graves and ate them. Yea, she passed beneath our feet. We came to the high mountains. We passed upward where the eyes of strange beasts glared upon us. I was afraid, but I called upon my father. Then the spirits of the great dead came down upon us. They wove kamiks and addies of fire. Their eyes burned as the great light of the stars. They did not regard us. We came unto the Amingma, but upon our return the hill spirits who live in the caves wakened and struck with their great harpoons. They shook the mountains. Then the good ancestors carried me through Sila, the world of the air, yea, my dogs, my sledge, and the Amingma meat. I had called upon those who went before me. I woke at the bottom of the mountain. 3 of my dogs were crushed. My sledge was broken. I lay there a while. I slept again, often. Then I lashed the sled, ate a little of the Amingma meat, and came hither. How? Ootah knows not. It was hard at times. I could hardly walk. The ice moved about me, always so. He described a circle with his hand. But I bethought me of Annadoah. He smiled, and I said, I go to Annadoah. That is how I came. I said, Annadoah is hungry. Yea, as I said it when the eyes looked at me on the mountains, when the hill spirits made my heart grow cold, when Ootah desired to return. Ootah, he hath gone. Ootah's dogs are gone. But I called upon my dead father, my dead grandfather, and the older ones, and I thought of Annadoah. He leaned toward her yearningly, his voice trembling. Fearfully the girl drew away. It is she who brought the Amingma meat, he said. It is she who led me to the Amingma. Yea, she brings you the Amingma meat, for the thought of her brings Ootah back after the spirits strike. It is she who lives in the heart of Ootah, who has done all this, but you are hungry. Come. He rose slowly and crept through the underground tunnel leading from the igloo. The others followed. Without, most of the tribe were waiting. At Ootah's command, the men unlashed the sledge load of meat, and the division began. To Annadoah, Ootah gave 1/8 of the load, enough to last by frugal use for more than 2 moons or months. Among the others, of whom there were about 25, the remainder was proportionately divided. For himself, Ootah reserved only as much as he gave the others. Outside Annadoah's igloo, all engaged in a joyous revel. Hungrily they feasted upon the raw meat. Then they beat drums and danced. Their voices rose in hilarious chants. Wild joy shook them. Ootah was acclaimed hero of the tribe. Although they have no chiefs, he was accorded the honor of being the bravest and strongest among them. And to the strongest and most heroic the last word in all things belongs. Of all who were able to participate in the celebration, Masangwak alone retired. From the seclusion of his igloo entrance he watched the scene with rancor in his heart. Over the northern skies the auroral lights played, lighting the scene of spontaneous rejoicing with magical glory. Great silver coronas, or rings of light, constantly arose in the north, passed to the zenith, and melted as they descended to the south. luminous curtain-like films closed and parted alternately like the veils of a Valhalla drawn back and forth before the warrior souls of the north. Tremendous fan-shaped shafts of opalescent fire shot toward the zenith, and like searchlights moved to and fro across the sky. The clouds became illumined with an interior flame and glowed like diaphanous mists of gold, half concealing the vague faces of the beauteous spirits of the dead. Their billowing edges palpitated with a tremor as of quicksilver. Within and through this imperial web of light, marvelous scenes were simultaneously woven. They lasted a moment's space and vanished. The natives, dancing unrestrainedly, saw heavenly mountain slopes covered with grass of emerald fire and glittering with starry flowers. They saw the gigantic shadows of celestial Amingma passing behind the clouds, and here and there were the cyclopean adumbrations of great caribou, and creatures for which they did not have a name. A tossing sea of rippling waves of light was presently unfolded, and over it they saw millions of birds, with wings of fire, soaring with bewildering rapidity from horizon to zenith. This faded, monstrous and gorgeous flowers of living rainbow tints burst into bloom. Fields of them momentarily covered the heaven. These the natives regarded with only half accustomed wonder, for they knew there were strange flowers in the land of the dead. As they danced, the colored imagery steadily faded in the growing intensity of the great banded coronas that rose from the north. A light of cold electric fire increasingly blazed over the heavens until a frigid silver day, brighter than any day of sunshine, reached its brief noon upon the earth. Rocking their bodies and singing, the natives dispersed to their respective igloos. Sitting on his sledge by Annadoah, Ootah dimly heard their voices echoing into silence. He experienced terrible pains again in his limbs and the fever in his head. Everything became dizzy, and with a sick feeling of faintness he crept into Annadoah's igloo and fell upon her couch. It was in his heart to ask her once again to be his, to repeat the protestation of his love he felt that he had shown he deserved to win her. But his utter weakness and the very enthralling delight of her soft hands on his forehead kept him still. He lay in a semi-delirium, suffering greatly, but at heart very happy. A new peace possessed him. Never had Annadoah caressed him before. Never had he felt the tingling thrill of her tender hands. Never had her breath so perilously warmed his face. For an hour she sat by him, perfunctorily bathing his wounds with the white men's ointment and rubbing a yellow salve upon his face. And while she did this, often, very often, she closed her eyes. Sometimes her hands, as they passed over his forehead, absently wandered to the couch. Sometimes they soothed the air near the suffering man. Then she would recall herself. Gazing upon Ootah, pity would fill her, and then her mind would wander. She was faint herself, tired and half asleep. Once, as she touched Ootah's hand, he closed it impulsively over hers. Her heart gave a thud. Her eyelids quivered. A smile appeared on her face. Ootah pressed her hand more firmly. He did not realize how fiercely in his fever. His blood ran high in a mingled delirium of pain and transport. He drew her slowly toward him. Her one hand soothed his brow, softly, very gently. The smile on her face deepened. She gasped with a throe of the old memories. "Olafaksoah!" she breathed rapturously. Ootah felt a horrible pain grip his heart. He opened his eyes, stark conscious. He saw the eyes of Annadoah were closed. On her face he observed the fond, faraway smile. He knew her heart was in the south. And in that frightful moment, his untutored mind, by instinct, realized why she had bandaged and soothed him so tenderly, realized, indeed, that in doing so, in his stead, her mind had conjured up the vision of Olafaksoah. His hands were strong, she had said. They hurt her. Ootah, with ferocity, gripped her little hand tighter. "Olafaksoah," she murmured again with delight, then, recalling herself, suddenly uttered a sharp cry of dismay as she opened her eyes. Ootah staggered to his feet. The utter tragedy of her devotion to the man who had deserted her, The utter hopelessness of his own deep passion blightingly, horribly forced itself upon him. "Annadoah! Annadoah! Annadoah!" he wailed, his voice sobbing the beloved name. The igloo was stifling. He felt that he was suffocating. Everything reeling about him, he crept painfully from the igloo into the night. He felt he must be alone. Outside, the aurora was paling with intermittent cascades of resolving lights. Over the snows, glittering rosy fingers painted running rainbow traceries. It seemed as though the spirit revelers were pouring fiery jewels from the skies. Ootah stood before that revealed and radiant land of the dead who danced and were happy, his hands clenched and upraised above him. "Annadoah! Annadoah!" He sobbed the name again, and in his voice throbbed all the piteousness, all the bitterness of his utter heartbreak. There was no reproach in his shuddering sobs, only sorrow, only the desolation and eternal heartache of that which loves mightily, unrequitedly, and realizes that all it desires can never, never be. Ootah asked himself all the questions men ask in such a crisis. Why, when he loved so indomitably, the heart of Annadoah should stir only with the thought of another. Why the spirits that weave the fabric of men's fate had designed it thus. Why the ultimate desire of the heart is forever ungranted, and an intrinsically unselfish love too often finds itself defeated. These questions in his way he asked of his soul, and he demanded with wild weeping their answer from the dead rejoicing in the paling Valhalla. But there was no answer, as perhaps there may be no answer, or if there is, that God, fearing lest in attaining the great desire men should cease to endeavor, to serve and to labor, has kept it locked where he and the dead live beyond the skies. Ootah fell prostrate to the ground, and his body throbbed on the ice in uncontrollable throes of grief. The aurora faded above him. Darkness closed upon the earth. Sitting in her igloo, startled, vaguely perplexed and half afraid, Annadoah heard him sobbing throughout the night. Eighth for a long, black hour of horror, they were driven over the thundering seas and through a frigid whirlwind of snow sharp as flakes of steel. Seeing Ootah turn slightly toward Annadoah, Mesangwak sprang at his throat. Their arms closed about one another. The floe rocked beneath them. They slipped to and fro on the ice. About them the frightful darkness roared. They felt the heaving sea under them, and while they struggled in their brief death-to-death fight, the floe was tossed steadily onward. The long night began to lift its sable pall, and at midday, for a brief period, a pale glow appeared above the eastern horizon. In this brief spell of daily increasing twilight, the desolate region took on a gray-blue hue. The natives, as they appeared outside their shelters, looked like grayish specters. Ootah felt the grim gray desolation color his soul. He had regained his strength, and his wounds had healed with the remarkable rapidity that nature affects in people who lead a primitive life. Only the hurt in his heart remained. Annadoah had often visited him, and while he lay on his bed of furs, she had boiled amingma meat and made hot water over the lamp very solicitously. Once, half hesitating, she looked into his eyes, and as though she had a confession to make, said quietly, "Thou art very brave, Ootah." This pleased him. Once she had said he had the heart of a woman. He had thrilled when she soothed him, and now he was half sorry that the injuries no longer needed attention. He loved Annadoah more deeply than ever, and his greatest concern was for her. He might win her, yes, perhaps some day, but he could not forget that. Whenever she had touched him with tenderness, she thought of Olafaksoah. Standing before his igloo, musing upon these things, Ootah espied in the semi-light a dark speck moving on the ice. "Nanook! Bear!" he called, and the men rushed from their houses. Without pausing to get his gun, Ootah ran down to the ice-sheeted shore. Nature, as if repenting of her bitterness, had sent milder weather, and the bear, emerging from its winter retreat, made its way over the ice in search of seal. Lifting his harpoon, Ootah attacked the bear. It rose on its haunches and parried the thrusts. A half-dozen lean dogs came dashing from the shelters and jumped about the creature. The bear grunted viciously. The dogs howled. The bear was lean and faint from hunger, and its fight was brief. The lances of 4 natives pierced the gaunt body. The bear meat was divided after the communal custom of the tribe, and the gnawing of their stomachs was again somewhat appeased. Some days later, 3 bears were killed near the village. The hearts of the tribe arose, for spring was surely dawning. Early in March, Annadoah, skirmishing along the shore, saw a bear disappearing in the distance. The animal was making its direction seaward, and this indicated to the astute native that its quick senses had detected the presence of seal. "Ootah! Ootah!" he called. "Atalak! Atalak!" the 2 tribesmen responded. With harpoons and lances, they followed the trail of the bear. Less than a mile from shore, they found it sitting near a seal blowhole in the ice. At the sight of the men, it fled. A close inspection resulted in the discovery of a half-dozen blowholes, or open places to which the seal rise under the ice and come to the surface to breathe. For a long while the men waited, standing near the holes, their weapons ready to strike. They imitated the call of seals. Finally, there was a snorting noise beneath one of the holes. Ootah detected a slight rise of vapor. Atalak's harpoon descended. A joyous cry arose. Breaking open the ice about the hole, a seal was drawn to the surface. Daily visits were thereafter made to the vicinity, and the hunters, patiently watching near the holes, succeeded in catching several seals. Other blowholes were later detected along the ice. Then they disappeared, and for a period no seal rewarded the hunters. The weather continued to moderate, and these excursions on the sea ice became more and more dangerous. One day Atalak and Ootah, while walking along the shore, heard a familiar call in the far distance out toward the open sea. "Walrus," said Ootah, the zest of the hunt tingling in his veins. "But the danger is great." "The ice split," said Atalak. "But we need food." Ootah thought of Annadoah. She had not been well. She needed food. That was sufficient. Moreover, he thought of the children. 3 were dying of lack of food. So he called the tribesmen and gave the signal for preparations to depart. A selection had to be made of the best dogs for the dangerous trip. Few dogs remained in the village. Many had been frozen by the bitter cold. Others had to be killed as food for their companions. Some had occasionally been devoured by the famished natives. And this the desperate people had done with reluctance and great sorrow. For, as I have said, a native loves his dog but little less than his child. Ootah, in the lead, with 5 others, started on the hunt with 3 sledges, each of which was drawn by a team of 5 lean, hungry dogs. After some urging, Maizangwak had sullenly consented to accompany the party. Joy flushed the native skin, for a thin film of sunlight trembled low over the eastern horizon. As they sped northward past great promontories, they saw several auks. Later 2 ptarmigan were spotted, and still later an eider duck. They began chanting songs of the race. Quickly, however, the brief sunlight faded. Heavy gray clouds piled along the skyline. The atmosphere became perceptibly warmer, and intermittent gusts of wind blew downward from the inland mountains. They directed their steps over the ice to a distant black spot, somewhat more than a mile distant, which they knew to be open water. There, if there were any, the walrus would be found. As they were marching, a very faint crackling noise vibrated through the ice under their feet. They ceased singing. 4 of the party paused and would have turned back. Ootah urged them onward. They paced off half a mile. The wind increased in volume and whined dolefully. Their steps lagged. Suddenly they heard the harsh nasal bellow they knew so well. The hearts of all expanded with the joy of the hunt. The dogs howled hungrily and with tails swishing savagely tore ahead. As they approached the edge of the sea ice, they passed great lakes of open water. The twilight still continued to thicken. The wind came in increasingly furious blasts. Nearer and nearer came the low call of walrus bulls. In a lake of lapping black water about 500 feet from the open sea, a small herd rose to the surface intermittently for breath. In the deep gloom, the hunters saw fountains of spray ascending as they breathed. Hitching their dogs to harpoon stakes driven in the ice, They separated and quietly took positions about the open water. "Woo-ar-ar!" The low walrus call rose over the ice. Ootah leaned over the edge of the ice and imitated the animal cry. "Woo-ar, my sangwak," near him replied. The water seethed, and two glistening white tusks appeared. Ootah raised his harpoon. It hissingly cut the air. A terrific bellow followed. The little lake seethed. A dozen fiery eyes of a phosphorescent green appeared above the water. My sangwak struck, so did Annadoah. They let out their harpoon lines. The savage beasts dove downward, then rose for breath. In their frantic struggle, their heads beat against the ice about the edge of the space of open water. The natives fled backward. The ice broke into thousands of fragments. Each time the animals came up, the hunters delivered more harpoons so as to pinion securely and at the same time dispatch the prey. In the gathering gloom, they had to aim by instinct. For an hour, the struggle between the alert men and the enraged beasts continued. Several times Ootah and Annadoah fired their guns as the green eyes appeared so as to finish the task of killing. Meanwhile, the gray reflection of the descending sun entirely faded along the horizon. A bluish gloom blotted out the landscape. The wind swept over the ice with fiendish hisses. With a quick change, the air became colder and snowflakes fell. The natives became alarmed. As they were drawing the first walrus to the ice, a sound, like the discharge of a gun beneath the sea, startled them. Seizing their knives, they dexterously fell upon the animal and lifted the meat and blubber in long slices from the bones. A great quantity was cast to the ravenous dogs. 2 more walrus were lumberingly drawn to the ice, the first sledge load, and 2 hunters started shoreward. Soon the second sledge was loaded. Ootah and my sangwak remained to dress the third beast. Like scorpions in the hands of the mighty Tornasut, the wind now steadily beat upon the ice. The 2 men were almost lifted from their feet. Not far away they heard the tumultuous crash of the rising waves. As they were lashing the blubber to Ootah's sledge, a resounding detonation vibrated through the ice under him. The field on which they stood slowly but unmistakably began to move. My sangwak spoke. The wind drowned his voice. Above its clamor they heard the ice separating with the splitting sound of artillery. Whipped by the terrific gale, the snow cut their faces like bits of steel. In the darkness which steadily thickened, they heard the appalling boom of bergs and the grind of floes colliding on the sea. Ootah leaped to the team of dogs and interrupted their feast. He knew they had not a single moment to lose. The field had surely parted from the land ice, and it was now a dreadful question as to whether a return was possible. As he was hitching the dogs to the loaded sledge, he suddenly gave a start. Was he dreaming? Was he hearing the disembodied speak as men did in dreams? He listened intently. Surely he heard a soft, sweet voice calling piteously through the wind. His heart gave a great thud. Through the gathering gloom he saw something, a blur of blackness, gathering substance as it approached over the ice. It moved uncertainly and seemed to be driven toward him by the furious wind. "Look! Who is it?" he called to Mesangwak. For answer, through the din of the elements, a voice called brokenly, sobbingly, "Ootah! Ootah!" Ootah leaped to his feet. Out of the snow-driven blackness, a frail figure staggered toward him. "Annadoah," Ootah murmured, seizing the trembling woman in his arms. She seemed about to faint. "Why hast thou come hither?" He hugged her fiercely to his bosom. He felt a throb of ecstatic delight. For the first time she had surrendered to his arms. For the first time he held her close to him. Death, for the moment, lost its terrors. He felt that he would be willing to die in that storming darkness, with her heart beating so that he felt its every pulse close, close to his. The wild winds almost drowned Annadoah's words. "The women came to me," she panted with difficulty, and Ootah had to bend his ear to her mouth so as to hear. They were angry. They said, "She stealeth souls, Annadoah stealeth souls." They said, "Annadoah hath caused the death of many children. Ootah, Ootah." They came as they do when thou art absent. They threatened me. They called upon the spirits as they once called to them beneath the sea, and the curse of the long night of darkness, hunger, death, they invoked of the dead upon me. I was afraid. Ootah felt her shuddering in his arms. "The women came unto my igloo," she repeated wildly. "They desired that ravens peck my eyes, that I rest without a grave, that my body lie unburied, and that my spirit never rest. And the curse of darkness, rage. They called the curse of darkness upon me. They trampled upon me with their feet, and they tore at my hair. They came unto my igloo as the storm came, and called upon the spirits of the skins to strike me, for they said I had again driven thee to thy death, that I had sent the others to their death. Thou knowest I lay ill when thou didst depart, but they fell on me one by one and hurt me. I feared they would kill me. They were angry, and they called upon the dead. The storm strikes, the spirits of the winds are angry, the ice breaks, and it is the fault of Annadoah. So they said." Her eyes were wild, her hair disheveled. Ootah felt her forehead. It burned with fever. "How didst thou come hither, and why?" he asked, his heart bounding in the thought that she had followed him, that of him she sought protection. "I know not. Methinks I called upon the spirits. I knew thou didst come this way. I knew thou wouldst save me from the women, and I followed. The way was dark. The wind held me back. But I knew thou wert here. My heart led me. My heart found thee as birds find grass in the mountains. Ootah, Ootah, I fear I shall die." She collapsed in his arms. The wind shrieked. In the distance 2 icebergs exploded. There was a flash of phosphorus on the sea as the Arctic dinosaurs collided. "Come, or we perish in the sea." Masangwak, his head bent near so as to hear, now yelled into Ootah's ear. Annadoah cowered at the sound of his voice. Ootah felt her trembling in his arms. "And he is here," she whispered. "I am afraid." They felt the great ice field rocking on the waves imprisoned beneath them. It trembled whenever it touched a passing berg. Masangwak prodded the terror-stricken dogs. Their howls shrilled through the storm. "Hook, hook, hook," he urged. Supporting Annadoah with one arm, Ootah pushed forward after the moving team. He knew they were being carried steadily and slowly seaward, but he had hopes that the ice field would swerve landward toward the south, where an arm-like glacier jutted elbow fashion into the sea and caught the current. Snapping their whips and frantically urging the dogs, they fought through the snow-driven darkness and over the moving field of ice. Annadoah murmured wild and incoherent things in her delirium. They paced off 1/2 mile. "Oh, late!" Ootah suddenly called, panic-stricken. "Halt! Halt!" Masangwak stopped the dogs. Before them a snaky space of water, blacker than the darkness about them, and capped with faintly phosphorescent crests of tossing waves, separated them, Ootah knew not how far, from the land. "To the right," Ootah called. "Let us go onward. Hook, hook," Masangwak encouraged the dogs. "The floe may land near the glacier," Ootah cried. He spoke to Annadoah. She made an irrelevant reply about the women who called upon the spirits and their terrible maledictions. With Masangwak ahead driving the dogs, they turned to the south. Annadoah sank helpless in Ootah's arms. She could no longer walk. Ootah supported her. At times his feet slipped. He felt himself becoming dizzy. The beloved burden in his arms became unsupportably heavy. They traveled in utter darkness, near them the desirous clamor of the waves. Seaward, at times where the splitting floes crashed against one another, there ran zigzag lines of phosphorescence. The winds howled in the ears of Ootah like the voices of the unhappy dead. Occasionally he heard the voice of Masangwak ahead urging the team. Ice froze on their faces. Frigid water swept the floe. Their garments became saturated and froze to the skin. Finally the dogs refused to move. "We can go no further," said Masangwak in terror. "I am resigned to die." Ootah stubbornly invoked the spirits of his ancestors for succor. He called to the dogs. Thereupon a terrific shock caused both men to reel. The ice field trembled under them, then stopped. Ootah realized that a section of it had swept against one of the many land-adhering glaciers. There was hope and greater danger. With a rumbling crash that reverberated above the storm, the field separated into countless tossing fragments. The cake on which the terror-stricken party cowered swirled dizzily in an eddy of the release-foaming waters. On all sides the inky waves seethed up among the crevices of the sundering floes. To the south, Ootah heard the breakers booming against the ice cliffs, which perilously barred the currents of the angry sea. The caps of the curling waves took on a pale white and appalling luminescence. "The faces of the dead!" cried my Sangwak in superstitious terror. "From the bosom of Nervik they come to greet us." Ootah, however, felt no fear. For once he felt unheedful of those in the other world. His mind was occupied with a more immediate interest, that of saving the life of the woman he loved. With quick presence of mind, Ootah grasped the rear upstander of the sled, which had begun to slide to and fro, and planted his harpoon in the ice. "The axe!" he shouted. My Sangwak passed the axe. Ootah grappled for it in the darkness. "Hold the harpoon," he directed. Mechanically, my Sangwak groped for the harpoon and held it while Ootah, with his one free hand, lifted the axe and drove it into the ice. With the other hand, he still gripped the unconscious woman. Her hair swished about his legs in the howling wind. My Sangwak planted his own weapon in the ice on the opposite side of the sledge, and Ootah, with unerring strokes, hardly able to see it in the darkness, pounded it firmly into the ice. "Thy lashings," he called. My Sangwak passed a coil of skin rope about the improvised stakes which secured the sled. Ootah whipped the lashings, then he passed them under and over the sled until it was securely pinioned. Very gently he placed Annadoah upon the mass of walrus meat and lashed her body in turn to the sled and about the stakes. With my Sangwak's assistance, he tied the cowering dogs to the harpoons. This done, the two men, benumbed and dazed, clung to the anchor for support. As the severed ice cakes dispersed, a curling wave lifted the floe on which they clung high on its crest and tossed it southward. As it rose on the surging breakers, Ootah felt the dread presence of Perdlugswak ready to strike. Each time they made swift, sickening descents in the seething troughs, he felt all consciousness pass away. On all sides the waves hissed. Torrents of water swept over the floe. Ootah felt his limbs freezing. He felt his arms becoming numb. He feared that at any moment he should lose his grip and be swept into the raging sea. Then he thought of Annadoah and conjured new courage. For a while the dogs whined. Then they became silent. One already was drowned. Ootah bent over Annadoah to protect her from the mountainous onslaughts of icy water. His teeth chattered. He suffered agonies. For a long black hour of horror they were driven over the thundering seas and through a frigid whirlwind of snow, sharp as flakes of steel. The recoiling impetus of the waters gradually increased under them. Ootah knew this indicated an approach to land. The waves came in shorter but quicker swells. The floe bumped into others. Ootah roused himself and hopefully turned toward My Sangwak. "We approach the land," he called. "We must bide our time, then jump." The waves washed the floe toward the distant shore. Land ice steadily thickened about them. My Sangwak realized that they were actually being carried to the sheltering harbor of the arm-like glacier south of the village. Ootah quickly began unlashing Annadoah so as to be prepared to seize her and spring when the opportunity came. From cake to safety, impelled by a warning instinct, Ootah suddenly looked up from his task and felt rather than saw My Sangwak near and about to leap upon him. My Sangwak's eyes dimly glowered in the dark. Ootah rose quickly. My Sangwak drew back and uttered an exclamation of chagrin. Ootah understood. With rescue possible, My Sangwak had quickly come to a desperate resolution. The girl lay between them. Ootah braced himself. "I hate thee, Ootah," My Sangwak shouted, no longer able to suppress the baffled jealousy and seething envy endured quietly for many seasons. He moved about, parleying for time and a chance to spring upon Ootah when he was unguarded. "I hate thee not, My Sangwak," Ootah replied. He steeled himself, for he knew My Sangwak was strong. He knew the ice was treacherous. He waited for the man to strike. "My heart warms for Annadoah, so doth thine, therefore thou or I must die." My Sangwak's deep voice sounded hoarse through the storm. "As thou sayest," Ootah replied. "But why?" Annadoah must be thine or mine. Dead, she cannot choose thee, and with thee dead my strength shall cow her. As men did of old, I shall carry her away by force. She shall be mine. Annadoah hath already chosen. Her heart is in the south, Ootah replied sadly. Fool! The other man shrieked. Didst thou not go to the mountains to get her food? Didst thou not thieve from thine own self to give oil to her? Didst thou not fawn upon her and perform the services of a woman? Thou liest if thou sayest thou wilt not have her for thy wife. No man doeth this unseeking of reward. I love Annadoah, Ootah said bitterly. Yea, and thou hast hope. Perchance I have hope, and Annadoah looks with favor upon thee. I have seen it in her eyes. Did she not greet thee as women greet their lovers when thou camest from the mountains, and did she not bind thy wounds with strange ointment? She thought of another. Her heart was in the south. Has she not sought thee hither upon the ice, when the women fell upon her with their curses? Her heart wings to thee, did she not say, as birds to green grasses in the mountains? Her heart is in the south, Ootah sadly moaned. The heart of woman changes always, cried my Sangwak. The heart of woman always yields to force. Psst! Seeing Ootah turn slightly toward Annadoah, my Sangwak sprang at his throat. Their arms closed about one another. My Sangwak breathed the wrath of the spirits upon Ootah. He fought with the fierce strength of one insane, with jealous, murderous rage. The icy floe rocked beneath them. They slipped to and fro on the treacherous ice. The sharp snow beat their faces. Water washed under their feet. At times they reached, in their frightful struggle, the very edge of the floe and seemed about to tumble into the seething sea. Ootah felt my Sangwak trying to force him into the watery abyss, but he fought backward. Time and time again, they constantly fell over the unconscious woman on the sledge. About them the darkness roared. They felt the heaving sea beneath them, and while they struggled in their brief, terrible death-to-the-death fight, the floe was tossed steadily onward. Ootah felt his breath giving out. My Sangwak felt Ootah's hands closing about his throat. He felt the blood pound in his temples. Desperation filled him. He determined to kill Ootah by any means. A grim suggestion came to him. He endeavored to release himself. In a lull of the wind, both heard something that made them start. Aroused from her feverish coma by the two men falling against her, Annadoah suddenly cried aloud. The two men stood stone still, locked in a deadly grip. At that moment, Annadoah felt the warmth of their panting breath as they paused near her. Where she was at first, she did not realize. She heard a clamor of wind and breaking waters. She imagined herself being tossed through the air in the arms of the tornado suit. At the same time, she became vividly aware of the desperate struggle nearby. Subconsciously, she realized May Sangwak and Ootah were engaged in a fight to the death. In the darkness, she sensed them moving away from her. Straining her eyes, she began very dimly, as Eskimos can even in pitch darkness, to descry the black outlines of the two men wrestling as they shifted nearer and nearer the edge of the ice. Then it dawned upon Annadoah's mind that they were being carried, in the jeopardy of an awful storm, on a floe that was tossed hither and thither in a maelstrom of angry waters. A frantic desire to save Ootah surged up within her. Behind him she saw the swimming blackness of the heaving waves. She attempted to rise. Her head swam. There was loud ringing in her ears. Her hands were not free. Her ankles were bound. She struggled to release herself, twisting her wrists and ankles in the tight lashings until they bled. It suddenly flashed upon her that she was lashed to the sled. She knew that at any moment the floe might crash into a glacier and be crushed to atoms. She knew that my Sangwak and Ootah were fighting for the possession of her, that both might perish, or what was worse, that my Sangwak might win. Chaotic terror filled her. Struggling frantically but ineffectually, she uttered a maniacal scream. Ootah! Ootah! Ootah did not reply. The storm howled. The wind lashed the floe. It fell like a whip on her face. Annadoah felt the surging impetus of the angry sea under them. She felt herself rising on the crests of mighty waves and being swiftly hurled into foaming troughs of water. Frigid spray bathed her face. Still the two vague shadows, darker than the night, slowly and laboriously moved about her. At times they brushed her lashed body. Then she felt the quick gasps of their breath. She sensed the strain of Ootah's limbs twisting in the struggle. Again she perceived the two shifting away and being merged into the swimming blackness. Presently she saw only the phosphorescent crest of a mountainous wave. Rising in the distance, she became cold with white fear. She felt her blood turn to ice. She screamed and struggled vainly with the lashings. She felt the flow rise, felt herself being steadily lifted into the sheer air, and of paralyzed fright again swooned. Maesangwak, by a fierce wrench, managed to release one hand, struck Ootah a heavy blow and broke away. Leaping to the opposite side of the sledge, with a terrific pull, he drew one of the harpoons out of the ice, and with his knife speedily cut it loose from the lashings. Ootah, stunned for a moment, turned upon him. Maesangwak desperately raised the weapon. Ootah heard it hiss through the air. He reeled backward. The harpoon grazed his arm and struck the ice. At that very instant the oncoming breaker descended with a rush from behind. A torrent of water washed the floe. Ootah was lifted from his feet and dashed against the sled. When he rose, he waited in silence for an attack. There was none. He moved over the floe cautiously, feeling the darkness. Creeping to the edge, he saw something dimly white and blurred on the receding wave. Maesangwak, he called softly. There was a pang at his heart, for he was truly gentle. He strained his ears to hear through the din of the elements. The floe suddenly jolted him as it was carried, with a thud against shore-clinging ice. Ootah peered seaward and called again loudly, "Maesangwak!" Only the waves replied. Hurriedly he cut the leather lashings and, leaping from floe to floe, carried Annadoah to the shelter of the shore. Returning, he loosened the dogs. Only 3 lived. Biding his time until the floe was ground securely among others, he then dragged his load of meat ashore. Sinking to the earth, he rubbed Annadoah's hands and breathed with eager and enraptured transport into her face. He called her name. Presently she stirred. "Ootah," she murmured, "it is very dark, very dark. I wonder whether it will soon be spring." He chafed her hands. For a lucid moment she nestled to him and in a terrified voice whispered, "Maesangwak, where is he?" She heard Ootah's reply, "He hath gone the long journey of the dead." Annadoah breathed a sigh of relief and again floated into the coma of fever and exhaustion. The journey before Ootah was desperately difficult in the storm and darkness. In his way of reckoning, he knew they had floated about 2 miles south of the village. The return lay along the sea and over crushed blocked ice. Much as he regretted it, he was compelled to leave the precious load of walrus blubber behind, so as to carry Annadoah, who was unable to walk, on the sledge. He covered the blubber with cakes of ice, hopeful that it might by chance escape the ravaging bears. His companions might come for it after his return. He knew the probabilities were, however, that the keen noses of bears or wolves would detect it. After lashing Annadoah to the sledge so she might not be jolted from it, Ootah, with a brave heart, started in the teeth of the biting wind. The half-frozen dogs rose to their task nobly and pulled at the traces. Ootah pushed the sledge from behind. He trusted to the sure instinct of the animals to find a safe way. Progress was necessarily slow. Fortunately, the snow stopped falling and one agony was removed. In lulls of the storm, Ootah heard Annadoah moaning in her delirium. When they reached the village, a half-dozen men were assembled outside their houses. They rejoicingly hailed Ootah, whom they had counted among the dead. He learned that 2 of his companions had gone to join Maesangwak. The first party had safely reached the shore before the breaking away of the ice. The news of Ootah's arrival brought out the women. When they saw Annadoah, they crowded about her, scolding. Ootah silenced the garrulous throng with a fierce command. They shrank away. "She came to me on the ice," he said. "Knew ye not that the spirits fared not well within her, that she was ill, ye she-wolves? She sees things that are not so, and raves of the curses ye invoke. Barking she-dogs! Aga, aga, go, go!" Assisted by several of the men, Ootah conveyed Annadoah into her igloo and laid her upon her couch. Her face was flushed, and as she lay there, Ootah thought she was very beautiful. She had become much emaciated. Ootah did not like that, but when she opened her eyes, Ootah saw in them a soft, new light. "Thou art brave, Ootah," she said, essaying a smile of gratitude. "Thou art brave of heart and kind." Ootah's heart stirred. Once she had said that his heart was as soft as that of a woman. This was indeed to him reward for all the frightful terrors he had endured on the storming sea. "And do the wings of thy heart not stir, Annadoah?" he asked softly, a world of pleading in his voice. "Wilt thou not be mine in the spring?" "In the spring," she said dreamily, and her voice quavered. "In the spring." A faraway look came into her eyes, and Ootah felt an infinite ache at his heart. "I am afraid, Ootah," she said presently in a trembling voice. "Afraid. My head burns. The igloo is black. Dost thou remember what the women told their dead? They invoked the dead to curse me as I stood by the open sea when the moon rose. Ootah, Ootah, I cannot see thee. It is very dark." Ootah laid his hand upon Annadoah's head. "The spirits do not fare well within thee," he said, "but I will care for thee." For nearly a moon Annadoah lay ill with a strange fever, and in her disturbed dreams, as Ootah watched through the long hours, she murmured vaguely but longingly for the spring. Ninth, turning softly, she found a tiny naked baby. Annadoah leaned forward, gazing at it intently, wildly, then uttered a scream as though she had been stabbed to the heart. The sun rose above the horizon and flooded the earth with liquid gold. Again the sea ran with running light. The melting glaciers shimmered with burning amethystine hues. The snow-covered mountains took fire and glowed with burning bars of chrysoberyl and sapphire, while on the limpid sea the moving bergs glittered like monstrous diamonds, electrically white. On the sequestered slopes of the low mountain valleys, green mosses once more carpeted the earth. Buttercups and dandelions peeped pale golden eyes from the ground. In the teeming crevices of the high promontories, delicate green and crimson lichens wove a marvelous lacery, and wherever the sun poured its encouraging springtime light, beauteous small star and bell-shaped flowers burst into an effulgence of pale rose and glistening white bloom. The suggestion of a very faint, sweet aroma pervaded the air. Above the promontories, millions of auks again made black clouds against the sky. Eider ducks floated on the molten waters of sheltering fjords along. The icy shores, puffins with white swelling breasts, sat in military line. Guillemots cooed their spring love songs, and fulmar gulls uttered amorous calls. On the green slopes the white hair of the Arctic gamboled, and tiny bears, soft and silken flossed, played at the entrances of moss-ensconced caves. Out on the sea, unexpected herds of walrus lay sleeping on floating ice. Harp seals sported joyously in the waves. A white whale spouted shafts of blue water high into the air. From the interior mountains came the howl of wolves and foxes, the sound of rushing waters, and the roar of released glaciers. Nature was vocal with awakening life. In her igloo Annadoah lay alone, for with spring the time of her trial had come. In the customary preparations for the coming of Annadoah's unborn child, Ootah had entered with rare tenderness and solicitude. When a little one is expected among these northern people, new clothing of the rarest skins of animals and the feathers of birds must be made for both mother and child. A new igloo is built for the event by the happy father, for the little one they believe should come in a house unspotted and white as the driven snow. Annadoah was deserted, husbandless. The women of the tribe remained aloof from her. Ootah alone stood by her, and Ootah helped her with unselfish, eager gladness. For several summers, in anticipation of the day when he might be a father, Ootah had gathered exquisite and delicate skins. These he now brought to Annadoah. There were silken young caribou hides, soft, fluffy white and blue fox pelts, as well as the skins of hares and the young of bears. Of these, Annadoah, in the last week of fading winter, made, according to custom, new garments for herself. Then, as the sun rose in early spring and the birds mated, Ootah went away to the high cliffs where the auks nested, and jumping from crag to crag, hundreds of feet above the sea, gathered 1,000 tiny baby auks, with crests of wondrous down, of which the hood for the unborn child was made. In these high crevices, from which at any moment he might be plunged to death, Ootah gathered mosses of ineffable softness, which were placed in the hood as a cushion for the little one. Near her winter home, Ootah built a new igloo for Annadoah, and never was one made with more infinite patience and greater care. Inside it was immaculately white, and when he lighted the new lamp, the walls glistened like silver. Over the light he placed a new pot of soapstone, for everything in that place in which a new life was to come into being must, by an unwritten law, be freshly made and never used before. He built a bed of ice, laid it thick with moss, and over this tenderly placed in turn first walrus hides, then thick reindeer and warm fox skins. He brought to the igloo a supply of walrus meat, and then, fearful to be present at an event in which he had no right of participation, prepared to depart to the mountains to hunt game. Before leaving, he crept half fearfully into Annadoah's old igloo and told her all was ready. She smiled fondly and reached forth her little hands. "Thou art very kind, Ootah," she said. "Thou art brave and kind." Ootah was at a loss for words, but his heart beat high and he was very glad. The natives watched Annadoah as, arrayed in her immaculate garment, she made her way with bowed head to her new home. They whispered among themselves as they saw the Olafaksoah wise woman follow later. When she sank on the new and wonderful couch, gratitude filled Annadoah's heart, and she murmured over and over again, "Thou art very kind, Ootah, thou art brave and kind." Somehow the bright igloo became black, and she seemed to be floating on clouds. She remembered the Eskimo women wailing in the moonlight by the open sea, and the curse they invoked upon her through the dead. She trembled and felt inordinately cold, but she knew it was spring, for outside the igloo, with blithesome and silvery sweetness, a bunting was singing. When Annadoah awoke from her delirium of agony, she saw that the wise woman had left her. The walls of the igloo sparkled as the flames of the lamp flickered. Over it a pot sizzled with walrus meat, frying in fat. In her half-waking condition, Annadoah realized that something lay by her, and turning softly, she found a tiny naked baby. Its skin was pale golden. Its hair, unlike that of other babies, was of the color of the rays of the sun. With half-fearful gentleness, she turned it over and over. Speechless with wonder, an inexplicable stirring in her bosom, she regarded its face. She observed its nose, the contour of its cheeks, the arrogance of its little chin. She noted in her child that curious and often brief resemblance of the newborn to the father, and this immediately recalled vividly and achingly the face of Olafaksoah. This was her child and his. Surely, surely, with great joy she understood. With this thought, an impetuous longing for the father filled her. Passionately pressing the little creature to her breast, she gave vent to the homesickness and ache of her heart in wild, convulsed sobs. The touch of the little one, the resemblance of its tiny face to that of the blond man, these brought back the old passion and longing in all their bitterness. Yet at the same time the child brought a new satisfying solace to her. It filled an immeasurable void in her heart. Now and again she held it from her, and suppressing her violent sobs, solemnly regarded its face. She could not get over the wonder and half-surprise that possessed her. With utter abandon she finally fiercely clutched it to her. The infant began to cry. Annadoah, with slow, cautious gentleness, laid it down by her side, scared, amazed. Thereupon the baby for the first time opened its eyes. Annadoah leaned forward, gazing at it intently, wildly, then uttered a scream as though she had been stabbed to the heart. When the wise woman, who had left Annadoah alone for a long sleep, returned to prepare food and to seek of the spirits the destined name of the child, she saw Annadoah lying still, her face upturned, teardrops glistening beneath her eyes. The wise woman placed some of the fried walrus meat, or serladok, the prescribed food for a mother the day her child is born, into a stone plate and put it on the floor within reach of Annadoah. Then she melted some snow and placed it by the couch. Slowly approaching the bed, she lifted the naked infant. When thy mother wakes, she muttered, I shall call upon the spirits. I shall give thee the name they gave thee in the great dark ere thou earnest hither, the name which was born with thee, and which shall be as thy shadow. As she laid the little creature by the unconscious mother, she saw a strange and frightful thing. The curse! And thereupon she knew she would not be called upon to learn of the spirits any name for this unhappy child. It had indeed been named by the dead, and with it the unuttered name must soon return to the great dark. With set lips and the grim determination of duty on her face, she crept softly from the igloo. Annadoah awoke. At first she gazed about dazedly. Then she realized that the Olafaksoah had been with her. She observed the meat and warm water by her couch. She realized also that the wise woman must have seen the horror which had gripped her heart like the teeth of wolves. Beneath lids scarred as by the claws of a hawk, the baby's eyes had been blasted by some unknown prenatal disease. The terrible dead, with their talon hands, had smitten. The child was organically blind, and being defective and fatherless, Annadoah knew that, by the law of her people, it was doomed to immediate death. While she shook with terror, withal a grim determination rose within her. All the tremendous urge of that mighty mother love, which has beautified and ennobled the world, clamored in the heart of this simple woman that her child must not die. As she touched the infant with a sacred tenderness, her very hands warmed with the impassioned affection that throbbed through her with every heartbeat. As she gazed upon the features, faintly suggestive of its father's, she felt that she could never part from this familiar and intimate link with the spontaneous and powerful passion of her girlhood. When she peered into those piteous, blighted eyes, mighty sobs of pity shook her, but she felt that she must be silent, and she forced back the tears. Outside, a spring bunting was still singing sweetly, ineffably. As she caressed it, the child's face twisted as if in pain. Well do I know, little one, thou dost desire thy name, Atagumadlun, she said. Thou dost desire it as that which is as precious as thy shadow. But the Olafaksoah has gone, and never will she breathe o'er thee the name I know, the name I felt stirring within me since the night when the women addressed the dead. Sweetly didst thou sing within my heart, but thy song came from the darkness, yea, from the darkness. You. Very gently, very softly, she pressed her fingers upon the baby's sightless eyes. I shall call thee little blind spring bunting, she softly murmured, lifting the baby and pressing its tender face to her own. Poor little blind spring bunting. She soothed its face, infinite pity in her eyes. Thou wilt never see Sukenuk, nor the amingma, nor the birds that fly in the air, spring bunting. All thy days shall be as the long night, and thy whole life shall be without any light of moon, but thy heart is warm and bright as the sun in the south, whence Olafaksoah came, and it makes the heart of Annadoah very warm. Poor little blind spring bunting. Murmuring softly, she rocked the little baby gently in her arms. Then she heard the ominous sound of a native rushing by the igloo and voices upraised. What were they saying? That Annadoah's child was blind. A frantic determination to escape filled her. The danger was immediate. She must act at once. But what should she do? Where should she go? She rose and moved bewilderedly about the igloo. She felt weak and dazed. At any moment they might break into her immaculate new home and seize the child from her arms. At any instant they might come with wicked ropes to wrap about the baby's tender neck. That she must flee, she knew. But where? Where? She thought of Ootah. But Ootah was in the mountains, and not a moment could be lost. In these matters the natives lose little time. Moreover, she knew the women hated her, and that they had succeeded in making the men gradually bitter. Olafaksoah, Olafaksoah, she called tragically. Then she recalled with a start that Olafaksoah had summer headquarters some 20 miles to the south. It was a box house, built on a promontory of the Greenland coast. She remembered it as she had seen it on a journey south some summers before. The way thither, dangerous at this season of the year when the ice was breaking, she well knew. Yes, she would seek refuge there. Perchance Olafaksoah hath returned. Did he not say he would return in the spring, when the bunting sing? She laughed spontaneously. Yea, yea, we will go there, little blind spring bunting. Quickly she adjusted her own new garments, and then she took the little golden baby, and over its head and shoulders laced a tight-fitting hood of soft young fox skin. This done, she gently placed the child into the hood on her back. Inside this was lined with the breasts of baby ox and made downy with fibrous moss. She hurriedly secured the child to herself by means of a sinew thread which passed about its body as it reposed in the hood, and which in turn, passing under her arms, she tied about the upper portion of her waist. The voices outside had ceased. Suppressing her very breath, she crept through the long tunnel leading from the igloo and peeped cautiously from the entrance. She could hear her heart throb. She feared the natives might detect it. 500 feet to the north, a group were engaged in excited conversation. Annadoah's brain whirled with the fragments of what they said. She knew the moment had come to depart. She emerged and on all fours crept to the protecting lee of her igloo where she was hidden from their view. An open space of 600 feet lay between her and the cliff around which the trail to the southern shelter lay. Annadoah summoned all her strength of will and then proceeded to walk slowly, with her head bent and her face concealed so as to avoid arousing suspicion over the dangerous area. Her heart trembled within her. At any moment she expected to hear the savage cries. When she reached the cliff, she felt as if she were about to faint. Looking fearfully backward with a sigh of immeasurable relief, she saw that she was unobserved. Raising her head heavenward, she breathed her thanks to the dead father and mother who were undoubtedly watching. She turned about the cliff, her heart bounding tumultuously, and panting the words of the magic spell, asked that her legs be given the swiftness of the wind spirits. She was very faint. She had scarcely any feeling whatever in her limbs, but summoning all her courage, bringing to bear all the love of this child she sought to save, she turned and ran. It was not long before she heard, or imagined, the angry cries of pursuing natives behind her. Tenth, a frail, pitiful figure, Annadoah stood on the cliff, wringing her hands toward the declining sun. "I ate," she moaned, and her voice sobbed its pathos over the seas. Besuk Inuk, unhappy son, Annadoah, unhappy Annadoah. 20 miles to the south, on a great cliff which stepped stridently into the polar sea, stood a house built of straight timber and boxes which for a half-decade had been the summer headquarters of parties of Danish and Newfoundland traders who came north annually and scoured Greenland for ivories and furs. The hulk of a house was weather-beaten, dilapidated, and scarred black by the burning cold. A more desolate habitation could not be imagined in all the world. A more devastated land could nowhere else on all the globe be found. For leagues and leagues to the north and south, the scrofulous promontories lay barren under the blight of the merciless northern blast. Over the corroded iron rocks, strata of red earth and deeper crimson oil ran like the streaky stains of monstrous and unhuman murders committed in eons past. Not a particle of vegetation was visible. There were no lichens nor starry flowers. There was no life save that of the black birds which winged restlessly about the sky and squawked in grotesque mockery at the region and its doom. In strange contrast, the sky was as blue as the limpid skies of Umbria, and nearly 200 feet below the gnarled, gashed cliff the ocean broke in terrific cascades of diamonded foam. The top of the cliff on which the house stood overleaped the sea, so that looking below one saw only the recoiling waters of a rich deep gold, capped with silver crescents of broken spray. From the sheer, precipitous, receding face of the cliff, knife-like granite spars projected, and in the crevices and nooks of these countless birds nested, hungry, desirous, and satiate, the voice of that fearful and balefully luring world. There sounded eternally the roar and crash of the breaking golden waves. Over the uneven, scraggy promontory, blinded by the fierce sunlight, Annadoah staggered. The world reeled about her. The sky above her had become black. Before her, a small speck in the distance, she saw the black wooden house silhouetted against the molten sea. She could scarcely move her legs. She ached in every limb. Every moment she felt as if she would swoon, but the frenzied fear in her heart urged her on. She suffered intolerably. Of that long, tortuous journey Annadoah had no clear remembrance. With each step her one urging, predominant thought had been to forge ahead, to keep from swooning, to escape those who were angrily calling far behind. Leaving her village, along the difficult broken coast her trail lay, it crept painfully up over the slippery sides of melting glaciers, some of them 1,000 feet high, and made sheer descents over places where the ice was splitting. It writhed about hundreds of irregular sounds and twisted fjords. In her desperation to escape, Annadoah, without a thought of the danger, essayed to cross fjords where the ice was breaking. As she sped over deceptive unbroken areas, the ice often split under her feet. In one of the sounds, jammed ice was moving. To go around it she knew would mean a loss of 3 miles. She leaped upon the heaving ice. It rocked dangerously beneath her feet. As she left the shore, the current increased. The ice moved more swiftly. From cake to cake she leaped with the agility of an Arctic deer. The ice floes swirled under her and tilted as her feet alighted. Halfway across, her foot slipped. The ice fragment eluded her wild grasp, and she sank into the frigid water. She felt herself sinking. For a moment she seemed unable to continue the struggle. Then she recalled the dear burden upon her back. She fought the swift current and grappled madly with the jamming ice. It gathered about her. She feared she would be buried by the force of the impact. But with a mighty struggle, she finally grasped hold of a fortunate ridge on a cake and clambered to its surface. The baby was unscathed. It was crying loudly in its hood. Although her hands were almost frozen, the cold water had not entered her garments. She leaped into the air and fled. She next scaled the rocky face of a precipice to gain time. The rocks cut her face and hands. Swarms of birds, frightened from their nests, surrounded her. Their cries filled her with terror. Reaching on the farther side, shallow streams over which thin ice lay, she bravely forged ahead. The ice broke. Her feet sank into the mud. Her breath gave out. She felt paralyzing pangs in her lungs. Yet the cries behind, which had become somewhat more distant, urged her on. Again and again, in crossing water moving with broken ice, her feet slipped into black, treacherous streams, and swimming with native skill, she saved the child from the least harm. By degrees its cries ceased and it fell into slumber. Occasionally Annadoah was compelled to rest to regain her breath. Her reserve strength, as is that of her people, was tremendous. Staggering slowly ahead, she often sank into engulfing morasses where the earth had melted and willows were sprouting. Panting, trembling in every limb, she fought her way out. For the better part of the journey her legs moved mechanically. She was only half conscious. Urged by her superhuman determination, the little woman struggled over 20 miles, and when she reached the great promontory where the house stood, her kamiks were torn. Her clothing was soaked with frigid water, and her hands were bleeding from wounds inflicted by the sharp rocks. Behind her, in her delirious flight, Annadoah ever heard the threatening cries of pursuing tribesmen. As she approached the wooden house, she staggered to and fro, and at one time was perilously near the edge of the cliff. Upon her back the infant slept peacefully. "Olafaksoah! Olafaksoah!" She struggled to call, but her voice fell to a whisper. The windows of the grim house were as black as burnt holes. They glared at her unseeingly without welcome, like blind eyes. Desperately she raised her voice. Only a panting, breathless plaint quavered over the dumb, unreplying rocks. The sea licked its yellow, hungry tongues below. At the door of the frame house, Annadoah paused, and still without losing hope again essayed to call. Her voice broke. The house was undoubtedly vacant. There was no reply. She bent her head to listen. She could hardly hear because of the pound of blood in her ears. Surely he had come. Did he not say he would come in the spring? She tried the door. It was locked. She beat it frenziedly with her fist. She beat it until her fingers bled. Then she threw her body against it like a mad thing. With crooked fingers she clawed savagely at the wood. At last she quelled the tumult in her bosom and found voice. "Olafaksoah! Olafaksoah! Olafaksoah! Ow! She screamed. She sank to her knees and pounded at the doorsill with her fists. When the native tribesmen, furious at her flight, at her temerity in trying to evade their inviolable law, clambered up the cliff, they saw a dark, stark figure lying still before the door of the box house. Their voices rose in a raucous clamor. Like wolves descending eagerly upon their prey, they bore down upon the unconscious woman. Some of the women of the tribe had accompanied them. Their voices rose with eager, glad calls to vengeance. They demanded the life of Annadoah's child without delay. The shrill howl of their dogs was mingled in that vindictive, savage chorus. "Little blind spring bunting," Annadoah murmured, awakened from her trance by the approaching calls. Opening her eyes, she saw the troop descending. Staggering to her feet, she stood with her back against the door, facing the clamoring crowd defiantly. In their veins the savage blood of fierce centuries was aroused. In Annadoah's heart all the primitive ferocity of maternal protection. They surrounded her. The struggle was brief. In a moment, while strong hands held her, they cut the sinew lashing and rudely tore the baby from its hood. Annadoah fell back, half stunned, against the floor. In their midst the merciless howling natives had the helpless infant. As they bore it over the promontory, Annadoah uttered a savage, snarling cry as of a mountain wolf robbed of its youngling, and furiously rushed after them. Grasping hold of two of the men, she piteously begged them to give her the child. She made frantic promises. She pleaded. She sobbed. She raved incoherently. Holding to the men with a fierce grip, she was dragged along on her knees. Then letting go, she cursed the tribe. She called upon them the malediction of all the spirits. Her voice broke. She could only scream. She tore her hair and fell prostrate, her body throbbing on the rocks. Above the clamor, Annadoah suddenly heard a strangely familiar voice shouting from the distance. Raising herself slightly, she saw a well-known figure bounding over the promontory toward the murderous natives. Her heart bounded. She recognized Ootah. Having returned from the mountains, Ootah had learned of Annadoah's flight and the pursuit, and with an unselfish determination to save the child, he had immediately followed. At the very edge of the cliff, the natives paused. In his hands, Ootah, the leader of the pursuit, held the crying babe. Their voices were raised to an uproar. The women were chattering fiercely. With quick dexterity, Ootah loosely twisted a leather thong about the baby's neck, and in haste to finish the tragic task began swaying it in his hands so as to give the helpless creature momentum in its plunge to death. Ootah bounded toward them. "Oh, late! Oh, late! Halt!" Ootah cried. "I will be father to Annadoah's child." The crowd turned. For a moment they gazed with mingled feelings of awed surprise, half-incredulous wonder, and speechless admiration upon this man who offered to make the greatest sacrifice possible to one of the tribe, to become the father, protector, and supporter of another man's helpless, defective infant. For, according to their custom, they just as spontaneously grant life to a defective child when a member offers to assume sole responsibility for its keeping, as they are implacably determined upon its death if its mother is husbandless. But seldom does any man make this sacrifice. In this land of rigorous hardship and starvation, it means much. Ootah fought his way among them. They gave way, and a low groan arose. His noble offer had come too late. On the crest of a golden wave, a tiny white speck of a baby face gazed in open-eyed, frightened astonishment skyward, and in a lull of the intermittent rush of waters, a thin, piercing baby cry arose from the golden sea. Awe-stricken, abashed, suddenly overwhelmed with regret and shame, the natives silently drew back. Ootah paused at the very edge of the cliff. He saw Annadoah's pleading white face. He extended his arms as a bird opens its wings for flight, and brought the fingertips of his hands together above his head. For a moment his body slightly swayed, then poising to secure unerring aim, he leaped into the dashing sea. Still and statuesque as a figure of stone, but wild-eyed, Annadoah stood alone on the extreme edge of the precipitous cliff and watched the struggle in the dizzy depths below, awed by the splendor of a heroism so dauntless, a love so overwhelming, unselfish and great. The natives retreated to a far distance and waited in fearful silence. The prolonged infinity of suspense and horror of many long Arctic nights seemed concentrated in the brief spell that Annadoah tensely, breathlessly watched the struggle of the man to save her child. Annadoah saw Ootah disappear in the waters after his desperate dive from the cliff and rise with unerring precision on the surface near the sinking babe. The sea came thundering against the jagged rocks in long, terrific swells, and was hurled back in a torrential tumult of breaking foam. Ootah fought the seething waves in his effort to grapple the living thing which was to Annadoah as the heart of her bosom. The tiny speck had begun to sink. Ootah made a dive under the water and rose with the infant clasped in his left arm. With only one hand free, he made a desperate struggle against the onslaught of the terrible watery catapults as they hurled him nearer and nearer toward the rocks beneath the cliff. Annadoah saw his white hand, glistening with water, shine in the sunlight as he tried to climb against the impetus of the sea. Sometimes his head sank, then only the struggling hand was seen. She crept dangerously closer to the edge of the cliff. Slowly but steadily, Ootah and the child were being swept backward. By degrees, the steady strokes of Ootah's arm began to waver. Annadoah saw him being carried further and further under the cliff by the irresistible momentum of the waves, to be dashed against the jagged rocks beneath. She knew meant death. Her heart seemed to stop. But presently, swirling helplessly in the foaming cauldron of a receding breaker, she saw Ootah, still clasping the baby, emerge from under the rocks. He still lived. He still fought. Annadoah watched each desperate, failing stroke. She saw his strength giving out in that unequal struggle, saw his arm frenziedly but ineffectually beating the water, saw his head disappear for longer and still longer periods. She caught a last vision of his white upturned face, of his eyes filled with importunate devotion, gazing directly at her from out the blinding waters. Then she fell to her knees, and lowering her body, gazed wildly for a long, long time into the sea. Suddenly she uttered a low, sharp, involuntary cry, and the waiting tribesmen, recoiling as though stunned, understood. They all loved Ootah. None dared, none could speak. Silent, grief-stricken, they turned away their faces. Even their dogs were still. Annadoah still peered, searchingly for a long time, into the sea. No, there was nothing there, nothing. On the aureate waves was no speck of life. Rising, Annadoah gazed with wide open, solemn eyes seaward. For the moment she felt in her heart only a dull ache. Along the horizon to the east, the sun, irradiant and magnified, lay low over the heaving seas. Over its face, like a veil of gold, translucent vapors, the breath of Kokoya, the god of waters, rose from the melting flows. A strange spell seemed suddenly to have fallen over the earth. Out on the ocean, the great bergs, which had majestically moved southward like the phantoms of perished ships, seemed to pause. The little birds which had clustered about the rocks disappeared. High in the sky above her, a sinister blackbird poised motionless in the air. At her feet, the roaring clamor of the waves seemed resolved into the solemn, sobbing measure of some chant for the dead. Slowly and by degrees, the utter realization of her loss dawned upon the soul of Annadoah, and to her, in that magical spell, the spirits of nature and the souls of the dead began to manifest themselves. Out of the crimson-shot vapors, mystical forms took shape. Annadoah saw the beautiful face of Nervik, and in the mist saw her watery green and wondrous tresses of uncombed hair. She saw the nebulous shadow of the dreaded Colcoya, the pitiless god of the waters, to whose cold, compassionless bosom had been gathered Ootah and little blind spring bunting. Along the horizon, Annadoah saw the clouds moving to the south. Higher up they moved to the west, and toward the zenith stray flecks moved to the north. The spirits of the air were not at peace among themselves, and dire things were brooding. From the inland highlands of Greenland now came a series of swift explosions, and in the brief succeeding interval there was an unearthly silence. Then a grinding crash rent the air. The spirits of the mountains had engaged in combat, and in the swift downward surge of the glacial avalanches, Annadoah saw tribes wiped from existence and villages swept into the sun-litten sea. But Annadoah knew that the sun-litten sea was a treacherous sea. She knew that Koyoka, whose face in the mist was wan, whose lips were golden, had no love for men, and she knew that the spirits of the air, who moved in the diversely soaring clouds, were engaged in some fell conspiracy against her helpless race. A vague realization of the impotence of humanity against fate, against the forces that weave the loom of life within and without one's heart, weighed crushingly upon her. Radiant indeed was the sky, and softly molten golden the glorious sea, but yet grim and grisly behind this smiling face of nature. Annadoah, primitive child of the human race, shudderingly felt the malevolent and evil eyes of Olafaksoah, the spirit of great evil, he who brings sickness and death. Annadoah felt that instinctive fear which humanity has felt from the beginning, the superstitious terror of tribes who confront extinction in the face of famine, the quiet white tremor of the hard-working hordes of modern cities in the face of poverty and starvation, the dread of savage and civilized races alike of the incomprehensible factor in the universe which wreaks destruction, that original and ultimate evil which all the world's religions recognize, interpret, and offer to placate, the force that is hostile to man and the happiness of man. On the smooth tossing waters, reflecting the glory of the sky, there was no sign of those who had perished. Then, after the first crushing sense of helplessness, an instinctive, insurgent hope that would not be defeated asserted itself. Annadoah called upon Nervik, for surely Nervik was kind to men. She pleaded with Colcoya. She importuned the spirits of the sea and air to return her beloved ones to her. Nervik, Nervik, Annadoah supplicated persuasively, gentle spirit of the sea, lift Ootah unto me, thou who art kind to man, and givest him fishes from the deep for food. Give unto Annadoah's arms little blind spring bunting. She swayed her frail body to and fro, and in a tremulous plaintive chant told unto the gentle and gracious spirit of the waters all that Ootah had been, all that he had done for the tribe, of his prowess, of his love for her, of her own hardness, and how she had turned a deaf ear to his pleading. Incident after incident she recalled. She told of the long night when Ootah went by moonlight into the mountains, how he had braved the hill spirits, how they struck him in the frigid highlands, and how the beneficent colonial had brought him home. Her exquisite voice rose to a splendid crescendo as she described that valorous adventure, and in the chant ran the motifs of the hill spirit anger, the brave leaping steps of Ootah, the tremor of the mountains as they were struck, and the deep tenderness of Ootah's love. In that customary chanting addressed to the spirits, Annadoah told of Ootah's return from the mountains, of the suffering he endured, and how, when she soothed him, she thought of the great trader from the south. She recalled how he had staggered from the igloo, the agony in his eyes, and how she heard him sobbing his heartbreak in the auroral silence without her igloo through the long sleep. Extending her arms over the sea, Annadoah reiterated, after each statement of Ootah's bravery, her plea to Nervik that Ootah be given back to her. "Nervik, Nervik," she called, "surely thou art kind. O thou whom, when the great petrel raised a storm, wast cast into the depths by those thou didst love, thou whose heart achest for affection, hear me, and Annadoah will surely come to thee very soon, and comb thy hair in the depths of the cold, cold sea." Tears fell from her eyes. With self-reproach she told of her old longing for Olafaksoah, the blond man from the south, whose grim, fierce face had cowed her, yet whose brutality had thrilled her, to whose beast strength and to whose beast passion all that was feminine in her had surrendered itself. But he had left her. He said that he would come back in the spring. Now she knew he would not come back, and she did not care. As if to convince the spirit of this, she compared Olafaksoah with Ootah. She knew now that he had used her to rob her people, that his heart was as stone. Ootah, she had once said, had the heart of a woman, but now she realized the difference between them. She knew the arms of Ootah were strong, that the words of Ootah were true, that the heart of Ootah was kind, and she felt stirring in her bosom things she could not express. A vague comprehension of the pure spirituality of the man who had died to save her child, a response to the love that had stirred in the bosom now cold beneath the sea, all the primitive deep profundity of the devotion of that wild-hearted man who had brought a wealth of food to her from over the mountains, who had faced death for her on the frozen seas, who had tended her in her time of trial with the gentleness of a woman, his indomitable heroism, the splendor, the dauntless unselfishness and bravery of his offering to father her sightless child, all this, and more, welled up in the heart of Annadoah. Nervik, Nervik, to him who loved her, Annadoah lied. Dead, she told him, was her heart as a frozen bird in wintertime, but her heart was only sleeping, and now the wings are beating within her breast. "Ootah, Ootah, I. Her voice broke. She beat her little breasts. She bent over the sea and listened. For a long while she watched. Then from the shadows in the clouds, the answer came. Truly, Ootah was brave, and his heart was marvelously kind. Unsurpassed was his skill on the hunt, and of every animal did he kill, and great was his love for Annadoah. Even the spirits had marveled and spoken of it among themselves, but Annadoah had chosen her fate. She had denied the love that had unfalteringly pursued her, and now that she desired it, even so to her was that love to be denied. That was fate. Then in a clamorous outbreak did Annadoah plead with Kokoya. She groveled on the ground. She called upon all the spirits of the winds and air. In a tremulous, heartbroken plaint, she finally called upon the spirits of her father, her mother, and those who had gone before them. But unrelenting, passionless, the answer came from the shadows in the clouds, from the winds, from the moaning sea. To warm the wild heart under the water was beyond the power of all the spirits. They repeated to her, as in mockery, all that she had told them that Ootah had done of his mighty love for her, but nevermore might she soothe his injured limbs, nevermore might she touch his gentle hands, nevermore might she look into his tender and adoring eyes. His hands were cold, his eyes were closed, his heart was still. It throbbed with the thought of her no more, and that would be forever. That was fate. A frail, pitiful figure, Annadoah, stood on the cliff, wringing her hands toward the declining sun. In the midst of that wild, golden burning desolation, Annadoah felt her utter loneliness, her tragic helplessness. In all the universe she felt herself utterly alone, far away, awed by the heroism, the very splendor of the bravery of the man who had perished. The tribe stood murmuring. In their hearts was no little unkindness toward Annadoah, but forsaken, outcast, she did not care. Over the aureate, shimmering seas she wrung her little hands, and into the waves lapping at her feet her tears fell like rain. For the heart of Annadoah ached. Nothing in the world any more mattered. All that she had loved had perished in the sea, and she loved too late, gazing at the low-lying sun, veiled as in a vapor of tears, remote and sadly golden in its self-destined isolation, an instinctive, wild-world understanding of that tragedy of all life, of all the universe perchance, of that unselfish love that is too often denied, and the unhappy love that accents only too late, vaguely filled her primitive heart. Sinking to her knees, convulsed sobs shaking her, she wrung her hands toward the sun, the eternal maiden Sukenuk, the beautiful, the all-desired. I-O-H-H-H, she moaned, and her voice sobbed its pathos over the seas. I-O-H, 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 Sukenuk, I-O-H, Sukenuk, unhappy son, unhappy son. I-O-O-H, Annadoah, I-O-O-O-H, Annadoah, unhappy, unhappy Annadoah. Annadoah's head sank lower and lower. Her weeping voice melted in the melancholy sobbing of the aureate sea. One by one the natives departed. She was left alone. To the north the sky darkened with one of those sudden Arctic storms which come as in a moment's space and blast the tender flowers of spring. A cold wind moaned a pitiless lament from the interior mountains. Yellow vapors gathered about the dimming sun. Ominous shadows took form on the shimmering sea. Unhappy son, unhappy, unhappy Annadoah. Taking fire in the subdued sunlight and descending from heaven like a gentle benediction of feathery flakes of gold, over and about the dark crouched figure softly, very softly, the snow began to fall. Annadoah's flight, extraordinary as it is not without even more remarkable precedents. In one case, a woman who had been rejected by her husband made a 40-mile journey during winter to a spot south of her village where a child some years before had been buried. There the woman wept and thus consoled herself. Having exhausted her grief, she returned to her people. On the trip she had no food whatever. Nervik, a beautiful maiden, according to the legend, married a storm petrel who had disguised himself as a man. When she discovered the deception, she was filled with horror, so that later, when her relatives visited her, she determined to escape with them. When the petrel returned from a hunting trip and discovered that his wife had gone, he followed, and flapping his great wings raised a terrible storm at sea. Water filled the boat in which Nervik was escaping. When they realized that Nervik was the cause of the storm, her brothers cast her into the sea. With one hand she clung to the boat. Her grandfather lifted his knife and struck. Nervik descended into the ocean and became the queen of the fishes. Possessing only one hand, she cannot plait her hair. A magician who can go to Nervik in a trance and arrange her tresses wins her gratitude and can secure from her for the hunter's quantities of fish. It is interesting to note the similarity of the legend of Nervik to that of Jonah. But just as the Eskimos have changed the masculine son of southern mythologies to the feminine, so the victim of the mythological sea storm in the Arctic becomes a woman. Finale. According to the legends of the tribes, not for many long and aching ages shall the melancholy moon win the radiant but desolate Sukenuk. For having refused love, she is compelled to flee in her elected lot from the love she now desires but which she once denied, and this by a fate more relentless than the power of Olafaksoah, a fate which they do not comprehend, but which is perchance the will of him whose voice sometimes comes as a strange whistling singing in the boreal lights, and who to the creatures of his making teaches the lessons of life through the sorrows which result from the acts of their own choosing. Sometime when they do not know, the sun and moon will meet. They will then, having endured loneliness and long yearning, be immeasurably happy, and in the consummation of their desire all mankind will share. For as ultimate darkness closes, all who have been true to the highest ideals of the chase will be lifted into celestial hunting grounds, where no one is ever hungry, nor where is it ever cold. All who have done noble deeds will be hailed as celestial heroes. He who died to save another will attain immortal life. He who gave of his substance to feed the starving will find ineffable food and in abundance. He who loved greatly, who suffered rejection uncomplainingly, and who sought untiringly, even as the moon pursued Sukkenuk for ages, will in that land where the heart never aches and where there are no tears see the very fair face of his beloved, smiling a divine welcome, and her eyes filled with a radiant response, gazing into his own. The end of the world will come, and with it will cease the suffering struggles of all the world's races, and then all the highest hopes of men will find their realization in an undreamed of heaven, to which all who have lived without cowardice, ingratitude, or taint of selfishness in their hearts will be translated as the world's last aurora closes its mystic veils in the northern skies,